Part 1, Chapter 4 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The Attitude of Judaism towards Christianity. The Jews regarded themselves as the world's teachers and lawgivers. They alone, of all peoples, believed in the unity of God. Their history was a long chapter of splendor and defeat. When they escaped from Egyptian bondage and reached Palestine, their first form of government was theocratic. God raised up judges to meet special emergencies in their history. From this they degenerated into a monarchy, which, after the death of Solomon, was divided into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Unity in both government and faith was gone. Israel was overcome by the Assyrians, and Judah by the Babylonians, and both nations were led off into exile to the valley of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Only a small portion of Israel, or the 10 tribes, returned. The captives of conquered Judah were cured of their polytheistic tendencies, and, preserving their identity under Cyrus and his Persian successors, returned to Palestine. After the dissolution of the empire of Alexander the Great, who had conquered Palestine B.C. 332, the Seleucidae ruled in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt. Between these two the Jews led a subject and timid life, and finally submitted to the Seleucidae. The Greek religion was foisted upon them, but they rebelled, and determined to preserve their old faith and to conquer their rulers. Matthias and his 3 sons led the revolt. For a time they were successful, and hoped to restore the old Davidic splendor. Pompey was at this time in Asia, at the head of the Roman army. He was invited to settle the dispute. He entered the country, besieged Jerusalem B.C. 63, and, as was the Roman wont, took possession of the country and united it with the Roman Empire. The Jews had now lost all independence. Their later revolts had no other effect than to tighten the Roman hold, and to disperse small bodies of colonists around the eastern coasts of the Mediterranean. The Samaritans were a mongrel religious body. They consisted of returned Jews from Assyria, who brought with them those elements of pagan worship which they had absorbed during their captivity. They settled in the valley of Shechem and built their temple on the top of Mount Gerizim. The sect still exists, and consists of about 150 people. Their city is Nablus, which lies in the valley between Mounts Gerizim and Ebal. They have a high priest, and are still in possession of their revered copy of the Pentateuch, believed to be the oldest in the world. The Pharisees were the most educated of all Jewish classes. Their teachers were versed in the law, and represented the hopes, the narrowness, and the ritualism of the people. They taught a national revival. They originated as a class about B.C. 144, and aimed to restore the waning faith to its old Mosaic strength. Inclined to allegorical interpretation and devoted to traditions, they aimed to supplement the Scriptures by traditional accretions. The Sadducees originated, according to some, with Zadok, who lived about B.C. 250. They strove to restore Mosaism, but rejected tradition. They absorbed some of the elements of pagan thought, especially the doctrines of Epicurus. They rejected angels, the resurrection of the body, the immortality of the soul, and the divine interference in human affairs. The Essenes originated about B.C. 150. Their belief was Jewish, with Persian elements. They prayed towards the sun, and held that virtue and vice inhered in matter. They led a monastic life and practiced community of goods. All of these sects were in full strength at the time of Christ. The Essenes were retired, but the Pharisees and Sadducees were strong and prominent. But all the sects disappeared with the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, A.D. 70. The Jews are the wanderers of all history and all continents. From the time of their captivity in Assyria and Babylonia down to the present day, they have held their pilgrim staff in hand. About B.C. 350 we find a large colony on the shore of the Caspian Sea. Syria, under the reign of Seleucus Nicator, B.C. 312 to 280, received a vast Jewish population. In the insecure interval between Alexander the Great and A.D. 70, they had gone, in colonies, into Syria, Mesopotamia, Armenia, Asia Minor, Crete, Cyprus, and the Aegean Islands. In Lydia and Phrygia there was a colony of 2,000 families. They generally preserved their identity. The most concentrated Jewish population outside of Palestine was in northern Africa. Egypt, Libya, and Cyrene abounded in Jews. Alexandria was their chief center. Even under Alexander, the founder of the city, large numbers settled there, while he assigned 8,000 Samaritans to the Thebaid. Extensive privileges were granted to the Jews. They not only thrived in commerce, but developed thorough and broad scholarship. Philo, who attempted to harmonize Jewish theology and Greek philosophy, was a Jew, whose learning was profound and worthy of high praise. The Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, was a great triumph of Jewish learning. The first Jewish colony in Rome consisted of captives brought by Pompey from Palestine. They were assigned a distinct part of the city, which they have occupied ever since, the present Ghetto. Julius Caesar granted the Jews special favors. They were declared freedmen, libertini, had their synagogues, observed their festivals, and held the Sabbath as a sacred day. The cultivated Romans, however, always despised them. They were the usual objects of raillery and satire. Juvenal held them up to contempt by saying they prayed to nothing but the clouds and the empty heavens. The apostles observed a common plan in preaching the gospel. They went first to the Jews, and then appealed to the outlying populations. Paul's success among them was often signal, but from them came also his most bitter foes. There were great advantages in making the Jews his first auditors. They were already familiar with the sacred history antecedent to Christianity. They had heard of the marvelous career of Jesus. Their annual visits to Jerusalem, to attend the festivals, had made them acquainted with the popular estimate of the new gospel. To the Jew first was his invariable plan. But there was no long pause. Also to the Greek was the next step of the tireless preacher. End of chapter 4.